Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Brenner, VP of Custom Content at Cyber Risk Alliance, and I want to welcome you to this SC Media In Focus, sponsored by Fortinet. Joining me today is my good friend, Derek Mankey, Chief Security Strategist and Global VP, Threat Intelligence for Fortinet's FortiGaurd Labs. We're going to discuss their Global Threat Landscape Report that was conducted for the second half of 2022. Hey, Derek.
Hey, Bill, how are you? It's good to speak with you again.
Doing well, doing well. We have nice warm weather here in Boston today.
That's an anomaly, isn't it?
For February, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh.
So let me dive in with some questions, and we can just have a conversation. So I looked through the particulars of the report, and one thing that struck me is how this report shows adversaries using more reconnaissance techniques, deploying more sophisticated wiper malware. Can you take some time now and just unpack how this all played out in the second half of last year?
Sure. So this report was quite interesting, Bill. Not to say the other ones weren't. I think it just continues to be more interesting because we're seeing more sort of deviation from the norm, right? And actually, we're looking at new data sets as well. So a lot of cool new data sets that we highlight in the report. So we're actually looking more at TTPs now, right? The techniques, tactics, procedures, what are prominent. And a couple of things that stood out there, right? Number one, in terms of malware, one of the most prominent techniques for initial access is drive-by downloads. So they're actually using exploit code on planted on websites, malicious JavaScript, that sort of thing to actually deploy. Because of course it's transactionless in a sense, right? The user doesn't have to open an attachment or something like that. So that was one thing, but that's on the weaponization phase. But on the reconnaissance phase, we're seeing a shift more to these targeted attacks. So spear phishing techniques versus phishing, as an example. And so that's across the boards. Much in the world of cybercrime, much more targeted attacks that are happening. More focus again on that reconnaissance side that typically cybercrime didn't do before, because there's this sort of spray and pray, as we call them, attacks, right? So that's definitely a shift. And the wipers, though, that payload, right, in particular, that's the most concerning, I would say, because that's really what matters, right? When you get something nasty on your system, what we're seeing now is a rise of wipers. I think we talked about this in the predictions piece. We saw some indications in the first half of last year, but it's steamrolling now. I mean, we saw a 16% increase in wipers activity from the first half to second half, and 53% just in the last quarter in Q4 compared to Q3. 16 wiper families in total last year. That's a big deal.
Yeah, it seems like everything just exploded in volume, in number.
Yeah. And it's not just the traditional data wipers, right? It's sort of following a similar evolutionary path to ransomware. It started with the data, and now we're even seeing system wipers, right? Disk wipers. So data wipers to disk wipers. And we thankfully haven't seen too much of that, but we even did see a firmware BIOS level wiper in the first half of last year.
Yeah. So segueing into that, one thing I'd like to ask you about, another thing that I picked up in the report was the new variants that are enabled by Ransomware-as-a-Service, which in and of itself, Ransomware-as-a-Service has been around a while, but it's the volume. But can you just speak to people about why that is a big deal? In my mind, I look at it as you don't have to be particularly skilled to launch these things, because you could just buy these ready-made kits.
Yep. That's definitely a valid point. Absolutely. And that contributes to the volume, right? Turnkey, off-the-shelf solutions, essentially, that with a little bit of cash in hand. Again, it's a it's a business decision to these attackers. You invest some money up front, but you can reap the rewards if you're successful with the attacks. And with the, it's interesting with the variants, we're seeing much more variation, right? More variants of similar families. And we actually have a really cool view in the report that shows it's one of those psychedelic artworks. It shows visually code reuse that we're seeing, but when you actually look into it, what's interesting is things like a motet, as an example. We're seeing a lot of new variants, so old code that's being retrofitted now as well, which is pretty interesting, right? Because they're taking these successful, attacks and families of the past, tweaking them, adding some new features to them. That creates also a new variant. So it's not in the past. Where my old school AV had variants were polymorphism. So they would just be changing very frequently, but only a couple bits and bytes, right? A couple opcodes in the malware. Now that's not what we're talking about here, right? It's a different game. We're actually seeing code reuse, recompiling, and with the ransom-as-a-service model, it's people too, right? It's not just one person distributing them. These are business affiliates. So you have a human network, and from my point of view on that, the problem is every one of those business affiliates has their own tactic, right? Their own way they're going to try to infect people. And that's a big deal, because now you're not trying to understand, oh, I've seen this before. This is, APTX is trying to attack me. It's a much wider scope, right?
Yeah. The other thing, and this is something that just entered my mind as we're talking about all of these variants. A lot of these variants, it's also about targeting more than just your usual, hey, let's target this Windows system because that's what happens most of the time. But you're not necessarily any safer if you're running Linux, for example. Am I correct on that, or?
100%, 100% correct. And that's actually something else we did have a data point in the report, is we're seeing more payload being developed cross-platform now. So not just Windows, the wiper is included, by the way, for Linux, Solaris, Windows as well, of course. Mm-hmm. So yes, that's having an impact, particularly in operational technology, because in those environments, you're getting more of a mixed bag for platforms too.
Yeah. So looking at everything that the report maps out, if you're a cyber defender and you're looking at this report and you're trying to think of the lesson, what's the lesson for me? What should I be doing, me and my security team? What should we be doing differently that we're not already doing? What are some things that come to mind for you there?
So we always say, not to quote an old phrase, but it's not a matter of if but when. The volume is crazy, the attack surface is huge, it's very noisy out there. So, but my advice, what defenders should be doing differently, is every day operate off the assumption that you, that organization, is going to be a target. So that's a much different game strategy, right? If you know that you're being looked at, again, going back to those reconnaissance techniques we're talking about, you need to be on a, not a paranoia level, but an elevated level of an alert, right? And so that means consistent training, that whole kill chain discussion that we talk about, consistent training for the workforce, because that goes a long way, especially being able to pick out these spear phishing techniques that we're seeing, those sorts of things. I talked about the drive-bys being commonplace. So again, shoring up defense for things that could be planting payloads in systems when you're going, having IPS, NDR, augmenting the skills gap as well. That's always a problem. And so getting ahead of that, there's ways to do it without hiring your way out of the problem, right? So things like SOC as a service is one way, right? Where you can augment your SOC, use a hybrid model even too. ZTNA, NDR, we talked about those things, I think, in the past too. assuming the password is dead. Of course, there's a lot of credential harvesting that's happening out there. The reality is, we pointed this out in the report, that 74% of incidents we looked at are cybercrime related. 13% espionage, and then you have hacktivism and other things happening. So majority is still cybercrime and targeted cybercrime.
Yeah. So it's important to unpack all of these threats and how cyber defenders can do things differently. But I don't want to be a complete wet blanket. The news in this report isn't all bad. So one thing that caught my interest was the description about how the red zone approach is making it easier for CISOs to prioritize risk mitigation efforts and minimize their attack surface. Can you unpack that for us? Explain red zone for those who.
Sure. Yeah. So the red zone is it's actually a new strategy or approach that we're highlighting. And so you just think of a funnel, right? So we've categorized three views of the attack surface. So the total attack surface, that's everything we've ever seen. That's close to 200,000 vulnerabilities. That's very big, right? Unmanageable in a sense, or very hard to manage. And then we have an open attack surface, which is per organization, depending on what applications they're running, what infrastructure. Those are the vulnerabilities that matter, right? And then the active attack surface, which is the red zone, that's what we highlight in this report. That's per organization, those open holes, what attackers are actually investing their time in and going after, because of course that's the critical part. So that good news, bad news, right? Bad news is there's a lot of problems out there. Like I said, that total attack surface is huge, but the red zone, from our calculations, those holes that attackers are actually going after is only 1% of that total attack surface. So now you've gone from this boiling the ocean to, hey, I can focus on the things that are really critical. And it's a way for CISOs to prioritize as well. And the good news is it's manageable, actionable, and manageable.
And another question that's just occurring to me now, I want to make sure we hit on, for those who would use Fortinet, for example, let's talk company size, because I look at all of this and I'm thinking this is especially valuable if you're a small to medium-sized business where a platform lets you do things you otherwise couldn't do because you don't have a security team of 50 people.
Yeah.
But, there's also the unique needs at the enterprise level. I'm wondering if you could just kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so absolutely. There's always a fit, I would say, right? And it really depends on the need of the organization. So of course, at the SMB level, as you said, there are good platform solutions, even SaaS models that are available. So I mentioned the SOC as a service, but there's even things like for sandboxing. If you want to do deep detonation, you don't have to have a big beefy appliance on site because you're a small organization. You can do that in the cloud, right? Through even now, network detection response is another one. There's a lot of these form factors, in the SaaS model that are available to SMB as well as professional services too. So incident response, right? A lot of SMBs won't have an on-site forensics team or an IR team, but again, there are IR services and consulting services also that can that are available. But yeah, at the enterprise, very large enterprise, they like to build things in-house, or at least have hybrid models. And so it's important to have things like integration into existing security stacks. That's often what I see there, where you have APIs and how can you interoperate. We have a fabric ready ecosystem, it's called. So we actually have connectors and APIs that can go into that. And then of course, on premise, because there's a need for speed at that level, right? You have to scale that. You frankly need the hardware too.
Right. Any other parting thoughts?
I would say I like to look at this from a good news lens, like you said. So, you know, there are some good practical measures, and they go a long way, right? Like this isn't all doom and gloom. I think there's a lot of, you know, there's a kill chain or a supply chain, sorry, not a kill chain, but a supply chain that the adversaries are building, and everybody on the defender side has a role in the ecosystem. So all the stuff that we talked about from a solution, from organizations and showing up those defenses, doing you know, education and having that footprint in place, that disrupts the cyber criminals as well too. But then we're also doing other things in the industry to actually you know, working with law enforcement as an example, public and private sector collaboration, working on the disruption too. Those are all good news stories. So, you know, we can actually make some headway. And that, all that volume we're talking about, we're trying to drive that down essentially, right? So, yeah.
Okay, very good. Another excellent chat. I always look forward to these. So thank you, Derek. And also thanks to Fortinet for sponsoring this episode.
Thanks, Bill.